Well, to get inside the mind of a white supremacist, let's go to Tulsa, Oklahoma now and speak to alt-right vlogger Paul Ray Ramsey. Paul, good to have you on the Newsmakers. I know you've read the manifesto of Brenton Tarrant. Can you relate to it?
Oh, well, first of all, I'm not a white supremacist, so let's not do the racial slurs. I won't call you racial slurs. You don't slur me that
I
way.
don't know how
I
it's a
don't
racial
believe in.
slur. What would you call yourself? I don't know how it's a racial slur.
Hey, I'm a nationalist. Do you call yourself a Turkish supremacist?
I'm not
That's an
Turkish.
insult.
I'm not Turkish, nor
Or
do I
what are you
adhere
then?
to any supremacist notions.
I don't either.
However, okay,
I'm a nationalist.
okay. So for the sake of our viewers, just for a few seconds, for the sake of our viewers, you're on the SPLC list of extremists. You have,
Yeah, they're a left wing.
okay,
They're a left
fair
wing
enough,
group.
fair
Yep.
enough. You have tweeted, for example, in 2015, if I were the EU president, I would appoint Breivik as head of the Refugee Commission. We need some creative solutions. That's a man who murdered about 70-odd helpless teenagers unarmed in a holiday camp, so some hero, right? And he considered himself a white supremacist. Anyway, I don't want to get entangled in the web here. You call yourself a white nationalist? Fine.
No, I don't. I call myself a nationalist.
Okay, you call yourself a
Just like
nationalist. Be a nationalist. Be a nationalist. So let's talk about the guy's manifesto. It's called The Great Replacement, where he talks about white people being replaced, right? You've read it. Can you relate to it?
What does that mean? What relate to it? I understand the words. I understand the positions he brings up about white people ceasing to be a majorities in their homelands. Just like the Jewish people, they want to keep the majority in Israel, and I assume Turkish people want to keep the majority in Turkey and so forth. So my position, I would like to see Finland remain Finnish, and Hungary remain Hungarian. That's what a nationalist means, because that brings peace to the countries. When you have basically not 100% ethnically pure, but you have a common group of people that have common values.
Do you support the 73-page manifesto?
No, I mean there's a lot of things in that manifesto. Some of the things make sense, some of the things don't. It depends. You have to talk about what specific issues.
Okay, so he decided that all those things that drove him to do what he did were important enough for him to go to 2 mosques and shoot up a bunch of people. Was that justified?
Right. Of course not. Is it justified when Islamic terrorists go and kill our people, like in France, when they killed over 103? Is that justified? I don't think so.
Okay, so do you have sympathy for him, but he maybe took the wrong methods?
I don't have any feelings for him one way or the other.
Okay. He seems to have plugged into what they call the alt-right world, right? What a lot of people are talking about as sort of white supremacism and white nationalism in the digital space. He probably would have been sympathetic. I don't know. He has to speak for himself. But he's probably sympathetic to your YouTube channel, your Twitter account, and so on, talking about the same stuff. White people being replaced, white majorities needing to be maintained. So if not by shooting up people in a mosque, how else do you want to win this war that you claim to be fighting?
Well, first of all, that's a slur. I don't think he was subscribed to me. I did not know him. And Dylan Roof, who was another mass shooter who killed people, he subscribed to a channel called the Young Turks. Should that make the Young Turks responsible for what he did? That's just stupid. And no, obviously, I do not support what he did. But the point is do people have the right to express themselves, and do they? And that's the key issue right now, is that people are able to bring out their ideas. Because if you have censorship, all it does is it creates more hatred. How we need to fight this is with openness.
Well, his massacre was live streamed. He live streamed it on Facebook. And there's this game of whack-a-mole going on where tech companies are trying to suppress all of this being proliferated, just as they've been trying to suppress the radicalism from the likes of ISIS as they live stream massacres and so on. Don't you feel that this is the right thing to do, that you need to not allow this to spread because it might inspire other people to kill innocent people like those people in New Zealand?
Of course, anything that's an illegal act,
Mhm.
you need to suppress, like the video. I have no troubles for them taking that down. But yeah, his manifesto, I think everyone should read. Everyone should understand the issues, so they're not lied to by the media, and they could read his point of view. And then we can discuss how can we prevent this in the future, because just trying to suppress ideas doesn't make them go away. And by the way, he wasn't radicalized by the internet. If you read his manifesto, he said he was radicalized when he went to France and he saw the situation there because of the immigration,
Mhm.
because he feels that the France should belong to the French people, which is, I don't think, a horrible concept. And if you want to call that white nationalism, fine,
Mhm.
but you could also call me, I'm a Japanese nationalist because I think Japan should belong to the Japanese, or I'm a Turkish nationalist because I believe Turkey should belong to the Turks. That is what's nationalism, and that is a question a lot of people have, a lot of frustrations,
Mhm.
is they want to have their homelands.
A lot of people who were killed in those two mosques, out of the 50 that were killed and the 40 injured, were immigrants to New Zealand. How do you feel about them? Do you have sympathy for them?
Yeah, I have sympathy for anyone that's killed in a terrorist attack. It doesn't matter for what reason. Obviously, it's a wrong thing to do.
Okay, so you're anti-immigration and you feel that you need to solve the root causes of this. How do you solve the root causes of this?
By having sensible immigration. I'm not anti-immigration, but I think every country has a right to control their immigration so that the native people have the majority. That's our policy. By the way, the United States, that's our official policy with Israel, is that Israel will always remain a Jewish state. That's it. That's ethno-nationalism that we support. I support that for Hungary, that Hungary should always
Mhm.
remain for Hungarians. That's it. It's a concept I think most people can understand and support. It's not a radical concept. It's called self-determination.
Okay, and as we circle back to the very beginning to the tweet that I had mentioned, where you signal support for Breivik, he killed people.
I don't support Breivik.
Okay, so
That
what
that
was
was
the
a
tweet
long
about?
time ago.
What was the tweet about?
That's not even the tweets up there anymore. I don't even know if that's a real tweet, and I can't remember tweeting that. And I don't trust the SPLC because they're a bunch of liars. I do not support Breivik or
Okay.
what he did. And you got to understand, some people joke around, and there's a difference between joking and being serious.
But
And
did you say it or were you
we
joking?
need to.
I'm trying to
I don't even
understand.
remember
Did you
saying
not
that.
say it
Well,
or
what the
were you
hell?
joking?
Who
Yeah.
cares if I said it? This is not an advocacy of my
Well, he
position.
killed more than
And
70
part of having,
people. He killed more than 70 people and you showed support for him. That's my point.
I did not support him.
Okay. Okay. Final question for you. All your audience is online. Would you
Yes,
would you agree that the internet is an amazing place for you to express yourself?
it's an amazing place for everyone to
Mhm.
express themselves. Yes,
Okay. Paul Ray Ramsey, I thank you for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
thank you.
Let's bring in two new guests now. Joining us from Melbourne is Nasya Bahfen. She's a media and communications lecturer at La Trobe University. And Greg Barton is a professor of global Islamic politics at Deakin University. I want to start with you, Nasya. We initially wanted to have Paul as part of a three-person debate, but we thought otherwise. We wanted to get some insights into the mindset a little bit, and I think we did over the past 7 minutes or so as I chatted to him. Your immediate reaction to hearing what he had to say?
I think that his views definitely come from a very, shall we say, American-centric or ethnocentric sort of position. When we discuss issues like freedom of the press, we have to understand that a lot of countries in the world don't actually have a Bill of Rights, and freedom of speech is not sacrosanct in a country like Australia or New Zealand. I'm less familiar with the New Zealand situation. In Australia, we have freedom of speech, which is implied by the Constitution, but that implication of freedom of speech is restricted to matters that are political. Nevertheless, we do have a very free press. We have a free media, but I just think we have to be wary of approaching these types of issues with a very narrow ethnocentric lens throughout the world. There are different ways to approach freedom of speech, and you can have freedom of speech without hate speech and without incitement to violence. We're trying to strike a happy medium
Right.
in Australia between supporting freedom of speech and obviously trying to reduce the sort of the sort of messages that you saw in the lead up to Christchurch.
Right. So Greg, Barton, a lot of people would take issue with us for even having someone like Paul on the program, because they would say, well, why do you even give the guy a platform? The reason we give a platform is we're trying to understand the pool from which these bad memes are coming from and the bad ideas are coming from, and the stuff that would inspire someone to have that much hate in a place like New Zealand to go and shoot up a mosque. Help me understand, Greg, from your expertise, how much of what we heard from Paul relates to what we saw happen in New Zealand in Christchurch.
Look, I've got to confess, I don't know Paul's work very well. I think the interview you did was nicely framed and put him to account on his position. My sense there is we're seeing toxic nationalism, and toxic nationalism broadly defined. I don't mean that this is something that Paul would support in terms of the ultimate application of violence. Toxic nationalism is part of the problem. It's part of seeing that we're constructing a false problem when there is none. I mean, there was no problem in Christchurch that needed resolving, much less with violence. This constructing of a notion of some kind of ethnic national purity, which doesn't make sense scientifically, historically, sets conditions up for excusing really bad behavior. Right? That's why I refer to that as toxic nationalism. But yes, the broader right, and there's positions much further right than what we heard, is part of the problem here.
Right, Greg, and New Zealand is hardly a front line when it comes to, I don't know, a clash of civilizations. It's hardly, ground zero of people killing each other for political or religious reasons. But when it came to the shooter, when it came to Brenton Tarrant, he chucked in a whole lot of things, right? There was Skanderberg in Albania who fought the Ottomans, and there were the Serb nationalists and Radovan Karadzic and the Crusades and so on and so forth. Can this stuff only happen because of the internet, and do we have to do something about it?
Short answer is no. The internet is not the problem. It's an accelerator. It's an enabler. We live in an age in which cheap air travel by a jet passenger liner makes it easy for us to go around the world, as this killer allegedly had been around the world where he met people. That was a technological factor. The big technology at work in Christchurch, sadly, was the AR-15. And just today, Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern has banned military-style assault rifles. That's why the death toll is so high. Technology plays a role, and communication technologies, social media, internet certainly plays a role, but it's more of an accelerator and an enabler. And we're talking about extremism here, and extremism and radicalization into extremism as a social process. People who post and people who do outrageous things, including violent terrorist things, are looking for affirmation from their own virtual community, which is often entirely online or largely online. We do have to be critical of technology. We have to be awake to the way it's being misused. There's a very important article, for example, in The Atlantic this week about Instagram, which for younger people is used very differently than it is for people of our generation.
Right. Nasya, what's more important? Stopping the bad ideas which proliferate online, especially social media, or, as we heard from Greg, stopping those AR-15s and the weapons with which people take bad ideas to their horrendous conclusions?
I don't think it's either or. I think, Jacinta Ardern's actions have been exemplary in responding to that. And again, those are the sorts of actions that can be taken by a leader of a country like New Zealand. There is an entrenched and extremely powerful gun lobby in the United States, and the context there is completely different. But after a mass shooting in Australia, after a mass shooting in New Zealand, we have the political infrastructure to be able to, to put limits on the proliferation of guns. But by the same token, I would argue that one key thing we have to recognise is that the threat from supremacists or the far-right movement has largely been understated over the years. And it's important for us to focus on all types of extremism. The media and governments in various countries have sort of focused and honed in on the notion of Islamic extremism. But I think that's to our peril, as the events in Christchurch showed. As Professor Barton says, this is a case of the internet, I guess, amplifying these views which previously were restricted to very, very small circles. But when you have your views amplified, you begin to think that your views are sort of normal. and so it's okay to express them, and it's okay to eventually end up acting on them.
Right.
So I think we have to recognise that there are situations where the two can work in tandem. We can clamp down on hate speech. We can empower the communities who are the targets of that hate speech, hate speech to fight back. But by the same token, we can also do what to the rest of the world seems to be the right thing, which is to cut back on civilian access to military-grade weapons.
Greg Barton, some people saying, well, we have to look deep into the internet, to the 4chans and 8chans and live leaks and all those places, Stormfront, where people are connecting, communicating, just like Daesh or ISIS radicals go and find these spaces to do their thing. We need to look for the far right. And there are others going, actually, hold on, the problem's staring us in the face. It's in the mainstream. And it's a process over a long period of time of normalizing anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim rhetoric in the mainstream by politicians and the media and so on. Which one is a bigger threat in your eyes?
All of those things are problems. The problems of the way in Australia, much less the case in New Zealand, the way in which our politicians have, particularly over the last 2 decades, demonised people arriving, seeking asylum coming by sea from Indonesia to Australia, sending the boats back. That's one thing, but then demonising these people and playing to the politics of fear. That began with an election in 2001 that was regarded unwinnable for the Conservative Prime Minister John Howard. He won it on the back of embracing Pauline Hanson, one of our notorious right-wing now senators, and the events of arrival of a boatload of asylum seekers on the MV Tampa, and then the 9/11 attacks. And since then, this has been a problem in Australian society. It's played out, of course, across our media. The media can be a powerful conduit to counter this. It can also be a conduit, particularly social media, internet forums, for disseminating these ideas. And yeah, 8chan and 4chan, we know that that's a problem. But as I was mentioning, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the mainstream platforms, we have to hold them to account because they're being exploited, not because they want to be, but because they're not paying attention. And we've seen this with manipulation, arguably, into the US election from Russian troll farms, from other troll farms, quite deliberate sort of weaponized engagement. And then, of course, you've got networks of extremists who are doing it on a lower scale, but very effectively, and we need to be awake to that threat.
Nasya, as a visibly Muslim woman in Australia, with every attack, whether it's a far-right attack that's Islamophobic and anti-Muslim, or whether it's a Daesh attack against anybody else, are you finding that you're being sucked into a global cosmic culture war that you don't even want to be a part of with every passing day?
When we use phrases like Huntington's clash of civilizations without interrogating those phrases, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. The reality is the sort of culture wars and the sort of race wars that people like Brendan Tarrant espouse, and his followers. We do have a significant proportion of very vocal sort of supremacists and far-right extremists in Australia. But that type of ideology that they espouse doesn't reflect the reality for a lot of people of colour in Australia. I'm not saying that the country is perfect. There is systemic racism in several parts of Australian society, notably in the industry that I worked in for a very long time, in the media. But the reality is the lived experiences of Australians of all types of backgrounds is simply not reflected in the media. The latest census figures from 2016 actually show this. They show that the country is incredibly diverse. There's at least 50, there's nearly 50%, I should say, nearly 50% of Australians have at least one parent born overseas. That's immense diversity, but our media hasn't actually caught up with that. And so the reflection that we see from the media, which is then, I guess, articulated into people's sort of responses and reactions to the stories that they share and consume on social media, that reflects that very homogenized, very monocultural type of 1950s Australia, which doesn't take into account that a lot of the people who are immigrants, like the people who were shot and killed in New Zealand, as Jacinta Ardern pointed out, she said they are us. She said they're New Zealanders. It's certainly, though, after you're correct in pointing out that after every attack, Sometimes I do feel a little bit on the edge. After this attack in particular, I did go around telling people not to turn up to mosques because it had all the hallmarks of an organised attack.
Right.
And I didn't want my elderly parents, anywhere near, a mosque. But that, I guess, is something that you sort of weather as a new arrival to Australia. Greg Barton mentioned Pauline Hanson and her party. I've had students try to arrange interviews with that party. So I teach journalism students. I had one student have the party say to him, "Yes, we'll do the interview with you," and then they at the end they pulled the plug on the interview.
Right.
Because this student had an Italian last name.
Oh my
so
God.
his great-grandfather must have arrived in the 1950s.
Well,
so,
that's insane.
how long does it take?
Yeah.
But yeah, so.
Okay. All right. Well, Nasya and Greg, listen, it's been fantastic trying to dig a bit deeper and get to the bottom of things, try to understand. We don't have many answers. We have lots of questions, but thanks for journeying along with us as we try to understand. Nasya Bahfen and Greg Barton, thanks for joining us again.